The Psalms are global in their scale. Yes, there are many Psalms that are intimate and personal prayers, but there are also many Psalms that are broad and universal, aiming to give us a grand vision of the world from God's perspective. Beggars and kings, those who suffer and those who rule, all can find their song in the book of Psalms. Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage, and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us burst their bonds apart, and cast away their cords from us." He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath, and terrify them in his fury, saying, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you.' Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." The first line of the psalm sets up the situation with a question. Why? Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? It has the tone of astonishment, because the kings and rulers of the earth reject God's authority. The word plot is the same Hebrew word that in Psalm 1 was translated meditates, hagah. It means to speak or growl under your breath, which gives us this mental picture of rebels speaking in low-voiced murmurs in shadowy back rooms, muttering about how good it would be if they could cast off God's rule and be their own rulers. They say, "Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us." So these kings are saying that God has them chained up, bound like a straitjacket. Their demand is to rule themselves, to cast off any commands or law. And it's not just a political problem. The psalmist names the people, too. So this is a universal human problem. We're meant to imagine the entire world in confusion, madness, and mess, which is not too difficult to imagine. And the psalmist is saying that all the issues of the world stem from one thing. We are all following the pattern of Adam and Eve, rejecting God's authority as the ruler of all things. The serpent in the garden slyly asked, "Did God really say?" And this psalm echoes the same challenge to God's sovereignty. Who is really in charge here? So, according to Psalm 2, the core human dilemma is that we were made by God to be in a relationship with him, but we'd prefer to rule our own lives, thank you very much. But if we believe that God is the righteous creator of everything, we will always be in the wrong if we go against him. True freedom is not found in casting off the rule of God, but in living under a good authority. What we need is a good king who will bring order and justice, who will save us from our wayward path and bring us back to God. There are only 3 times in the Psalms when God laughs, and all of them have to do with evil people who think that they've beaten God. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. God gets the last laugh. He gives a mocking chuckle to those who delude themselves, and then he appoints a king. He says, "As for me, I have set or installed, coronated, enthroned my king on Zion, my holy hill." In response to the kings of the earth forming an insurgent alliance, God sets his own king over them, a king of kings, if you will. Earlier, this person was called the Anointed, which is the Hebrew word Mashiach, Messiah. In ancient Israel, the king was anointed with oil, and the title Messiah came to mean a future king who would embody all the ideals of kingship and bring all of God's promises to fulfillment. And suddenly, in verse 7, the point of view changes so that we get to hear this anointed king speak for himself. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession." This language is a poetic meditation on a very important passage of Scripture, 2 Samuel 7. God came to King David and said that he would appoint a king from David's line who would rule forever. Even more than that, God promised that this king would be a member of his own family. He said, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son." His throne would be on Zion, which is a reference to the high mountain in Jerusalem, and it became a symbol of the high rule of God and his chosen king. This king would rule over the chaos and anarchy of the world and bring it under God's authority. He would also be given power to judge evildoers. Verse 9, "You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." Some will submit to the king's good rule, but those that won't bend the knee will be broken and scattered. This is constructive destruction, removing rebellion for the stability of the rest of the kingdom. At this point in the psalm, we're asking, well, how is the story going to end? Will human beings lay down their arms and follow this King of Kings? What can bring us back under the banner of God's good rule? Psalm 2 concludes in this way, "Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." The only hope for rebels and mutineers like us is full surrender and submission to the King. First, be wise. Be aware of this history of spiritual rebellion and do the right thing. Second, be warned, because God's judgment is certainly coming for those who don't listen. Third, serve the Lord and rejoice with trembling, meaning reverent fear and joy mingled together, both worship and trembling, security and reverence. Fourth, kiss the Son, paying homage to a king in humble submission. There's a warning here about the just wrath of this king that blazes up at wrongdoing where others might have just let evil slide. God's anger is always proportional, always measured, and always for the sake of his glory and the good of his people. Finally, we receive a beatitude, a blessing. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Happiness, freedom, and flourishing is given to all, any and everyone who takes refuge, who finds shelter, who runs into the fortress of God's King. The safest place in all the world is not a location, but a person, the anointed Son, who will execute rebels, but who also offers them amnesty and immunity if they would run to him. There is no refuge from him. There is only refuge in him. So, the choice is put before us. What will we choose? Will we go our own way, or will we follow God's ways? Just like Psalm 1, this is the basic human decision that all of us must make. It's likely that Psalms 1 and 2 were composed as an introduction to the book of Psalms. They were intentionally placed here, and they were linked through verbal cues, repeated words and phrases. I already mentioned that the words meditate and plot are the same word in Hebrew, but there are other connections. The clearest one being the repeated word blessing. Psalm 1 begins, "Blessed is the man," and Psalm 2 ends, "Blessed are all who take refuge in him." Notice how the themes of these psalms set up the themes of the whole book. This book of prayers will center on God's way of life according to his Torah instructions and on God's good kingdom rule. When taken together, these two psalms summarize the good life, the core of what a life of a worshiper of God looks like. In Psalm 1, the good life is found in being rooted in the words of God. And in Psalm 2, the good life is found by taking refuge in the anointed Son of God. The earliest followers of Jesus saw this psalm as a promise that was fulfilled in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. They called him the Anointed Son, the Messiah in Hebrew, and Christ in Greek. At Jesus' baptism, at the very beginning of his ministry, God the Father declared, "This is my beloved Son." Jesus declared blessing and good news to those who were perishing. But the world's response to this king was not to bow to him, but to execute him as a rebel and a traitor. The Anointed One suffered the rod for the sins of his people. He was broken and dashed to pieces by the just wrath of God his Father. On that day, he who sits in the heavens wept. The rulers plotted, casting off their bonds and instead binding up Jesus. Judas kissed the Son, not in submission, but in betrayal. Pilate crowned him with thorns, stripped him except for a purple robe, and made a sign above the cross that said, "The King of the Jews." On a bloody cross, Jesus took the punishment for our rebellion. But 3 days later, God crowned his king not on the hill of Golgotha, but on the hill of Zion. He raised Jesus from the dead, placing him on the throne and laughing at death. And then, as his last act on earth, Jesus told his disciples to go to all the nations and the ends of the earth, which he already rules as his possession, to tell everyone about the good news that there is a better king to serve. The disciples of Jesus who were imprisoned in the book of Acts prayed through this particular psalm to understand why they were being persecuted. It was because they had pledged allegiance to the Messiah, the one who would execute justice on evil and the one who would welcome all who find refuge in him. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. There is no safety in rebellion. We need King Jesus' protection. We take refuge in him when we sin because he is the king who laid down his crown to die on a cross. We take refuge in him when we suffer because he is the king who rose from the dead and makes all things new. We take refuge in him when we stumble and we falter because he is the king who will not let us perish in the way. We take refuge in him when the enemy whispers propaganda of doubt, because he is the king who will break the enemy with a rod of iron. We embrace his authority because our king is good and he is the way to find the good life. How could we pray Psalm 2 and apply it to our own relationship with God? Here are some ideas for when to pray this psalm. When the world seems to rage, when headlines are frightening, when life feels chaotic and out of our control, when we struggle to obey the commands of God, when we mutter, "I wish that I could just do what I want to do." When unjust and ungodly rulers use their authority for their own gain, and you long for God to bring justice on the wicked. when you experience persecution and opposition because of your allegiance to Jesus, when treacherous people make shady plots and secret mutinies to undermine what you are doing, when an election or a transition of power is coming up and you hope for peace and stability in your country, when you see someone get baptized and in the life of that new believer you hear the echo of God's words to his son, "This is my beloved child." When you travel somewhere new and recall that every nation, even to the ends of the earth, belongs to the King. When you feel fear and trembling at the thought of the holy justice of God, who will not let wrongdoing go unpunished. When you use oil, say in cooking, and it reminds you of the Messiah, the Anointed Son, the King of Kings. When you arrive back home from a journey and feel the safety of that refuge, which mirrors the safety of Jesus, our refuge. When you touch a ceramic pot or plate, remembering that apart from Jesus' protection, you are just as fragile. When you want to take refuge not in yourself or in anything else, but in the good rule and reign of King Jesus. Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us." He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you.' Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." Thank you for listening to the Woven Psalms. This podcast is a ministry of Rock Hill Community Church in Duluth, Minnesota. I'm Mike Solis. I'm a pastor at Rock Hill and the writer of this podcast. Ethan Gibbs is our producer, editor, and composer of the theme music. Our logo was designed by Bo Walsh. This podcast uses the English Standard Version published by Crossway. We want to give a special thanks to Poor Bishop Hooper for allowing us to use the music from their Every Psalm project. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please share it with others. You can learn more about our work at wovenpsalms.com.